The fabric was silky smooth, the threads shimmering like water droplets, in a strikingly vibrant scarlet hue. The detailed embroidery depicted a heartbreaking tale of tragic romance, which compelled John to obtain it no matter what. He only remembered speaking with the ethnic tribal woman, likely in her late 60s, her weathered face etched with hardship. The tribal woman's teeth were pitch black, and she steadily chewed something bright red and juicy dripping from her mouth. John was certain it was not the beetle nut that mainlanders chewed at weddings and celebrations. No, it was the meat of some animal, though John could not guess what creature. He only sensed a revolting stench as he stood before the tribal woman to inquire about the red blanket, a horrifying odor that would repel anyone, emanating from the rotten flesh in her mouth. If John had not been so enthralled by the blanket hanging outside her home, he certainly could not have endured standing before her for as long as he did. He had waited until the tribal woman finally muttered something in reply. Though he did not understand her ethnic dialect, John felt elated and certain he had succeeded in this transaction. The woman spoke in her tribal tongue, simply getting up and taking the blanket inside, signaling John to follow her. John was very impatient, as it was already late evening. The dozens in his hiking group had long left this remote village to begin the return journey to Santa Fe. Yet he lingered, separating from his companions over his fixation on the blanket. If he did not hurry to catch up, he would have to spend the night alone in his camping tent at the roadside. But his intense desire for the red blanket made him patiently follow behind the elderly tribal woman's back. Outside, the sun had gone down, shadows blanketing the desolate village. During the day it was beautiful, with verdant terraced fields stretching far, fragrant forest breezes carrying the scent of vegetation, birds singing sweetly. At nightfall, an ominous bleakness settled over the landscape. Amidst the vast barren hills stood only the tribal woman's solitary cabin, accessible by a faint footpath rarely traveled. In fact, this area was so remote, there was not even a single electric light. John followed the tribal woman into her home. Seeing it was already dark, yet she did not light any lamps or make any attempt to illuminate the space. It seemed she had always lived this way. When night came, she would simply remain silently in pitch blackness. The ethnic woman's home was a very small, old-fashioned stilt house of only about 5 square meters. John had never seen one so tiny before. Tall 3-meter pillars extended all around it, decorated with dangling charms and textiles of various bright colors, a very curious sight. From the moment he came here, John sensed an unsettling aura that gave him chills. The house sat atop an isolated hill, surrounded by dense cornfields. The only access was a narrow footpath cutting through the corn and ending right at the tribal woman's home. The corn grew so tall and thick that at a distance the house was fully obscured from view. If it had not been for John's thirst for adventure, breaking from his group on a whim when he glimpsed the tempting footpath, wanting to follow it all day to see where it led, then he would not have found himself here. Nor would he have seen the captivating red blanket that so moved his heart. The path stretched on for hours until John felt as if he had entered an entirely different world from the one he knew. "Ma'am?" John called out loudly, trying to get the tribal woman's attention. The pitch-black darkness now enveloped him once inside the house, and he could no longer see a thing. After waiting in vain for a response, John grew impatient. He considered turning back toward the doorway to grab his motorcycle flashlight and shine it around for some light. But as soon as he turned, his eyes met a pair of huge, round red eyes in the blackness. A blurry face, the stench billowing up. John cried out in shock, "Oh!" That was all he managed before his mind went blank and he lost awareness. When John awoke, he found himself alone in this situation, surrounded by fog. Looking closely, he saw a blanket covering him, the very red blanket he had tried to buy from the tribal woman earlier. Touching his head, John felt a sharp, piercing pain, and sensed his skull had been struck by something causing it to swell. But when he touched his scalp, it felt smooth, with no bumps or swelling at all, as if the agonizing sensation was merely an illusion. Unsteady, John got to his feet. Despite the discomfort, he could not help feeling delighted to have finally obtained the blanket according to his wish. John caressed the soft red cloth, gently stroking it and holding it to his face. He felt only silky smoothness and utter satisfaction. The blanket was as supple as skin, so soft it was as if he was pressing his face into a woman's bosom. John did not pay mind to the strange feeling this blanket evoked, sensing nothing unusual about it, only a familiarity that comforted him. The sensation was completely unlike any regular rough blanket, but instead carried the soft bounce of a youthful woman's ample breasts, passionately pressed against John's face. Clutching the blanket, John scrutinized it closely. It was about 2 meters long by 1 meter wide. The fabric was amazingly fine, beyond any modern textile technology. Its delicate fragrance was faintly floral like a maiden, stirring John's heart. After breathing it in for a while, John suddenly remembered he had to hurry back to the Nam Nun Township County seat. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. When his awareness faded out, it had been nighttime. But now the scenery had some faint light to it, meaning he had likely been out for at least 1 full night. Fog obscured his vision. John had nothing on him but his empty backpack with some dried rations stuffed inside. He chose a random direction, hoping to get out of the mist and find some footpath to lead him back to civilization. At first, John did not feel even a hint of worry or fear. With the unshakable confidence of impulsive youth, he firmly believed there was a way out of any place. He had fainted and found himself here. This proved the tribal woman must have brought him to this spot. Therefore, there must also be some path by which she was able to get back. The only thing that puzzled John was why the woman had rendered him unconscious and left him in this place, even placing the red blanket he wanted to buy over him. It showed she was concerned about the cold climate here and wanted to provide the blanket to keep John warm. But he had no idea why she would do such a thing. The last image John saw was her terrifying wide eyes and foul mouth overflowing with some vile red liquid. That horrifying face had appeared right before John blacked out, and he guessed it surely belonged to the native woman he had asked to purchase the red blanket from earlier. But as John continued on, it seemed he had stumbled into a deep, dark forest. The fog was dissipating, and he realized he had arrived in a hellish place, not meant for the world of men, but only for the world of devils. A viscous pool of dark crimson blood congealed into a long, slimy streak. It looked like the trail left behind by some creature. John's foot touched the revolting fluid and he felt utterly disgusted. What was this? He wondered. John stuffed the blanket in his backpack and hurriedly pulled his foot back from the filthy red poodle. Walking further, the surroundings slowly started to transform. Horrific sights, John had never witnessed it before, began to emerge. Hidden behind the vast expanse of fog was now an enormous, monstrous castle. What sickened John the most, threatening to make him retch, was that this structure was built entirely from human bones, ghastly white bones. Where was this place? Hadn't he just been inside a small cabin at the end of a footpath? Where had that old native woman flung him? To this extreme point of no return. Which way could lead him back to the world he knew? John tried to restrain his revulsion and continued forward. He scrutinized the castle of bones, slowly reaching out to touch one section. Oddly, as soon as his fingers made contact, that piece instantly crumbled into a pile of dusty fragments, as if the bone had remained here for endless years. Next, like a row of dominoes, the entire massive structure of the bone castle disintegrated directly into powdery debris, clouds of dust billowing up. Just one gentle touch from John's hand had utterly destroyed the colossal edifice. He could not believe what his eyes had just witnessed. He rubbed them vigorously for a moment, then seemed to snap out of a stupor, because somehow he found himself back at the old cabin atop the hill, the red blanket still clutched in his hands. His motorcycle was still parked nearby, as if everything that had transpired was merely an illusion. John wondered what had happened. Bewildered, he glanced around, only to find the repulsive old native woman's house had vanished, as if it had never existed at all, just like the bone castle he had demolished. It had clearly been right before his eyes, yet in the end it had not been real. So where had the old woman's cabin disappeared to? And she as well. It definitely could not have been his imagination, because the evidence was still right here, plain as day. The red blanket was still in his grasp. After searching a while longer and finding no other inconsistencies, John finally had to shake his head and conclude the bizarre events he had experienced must have been just a figment of his imagination. His backpack still hung off the motorcycle seat, the headlight beam pointing down the hill blanketed in cornfields. John got on his bike and headed back down the old road to reach the highway, returning to the town of Santa Fe. As soon as he reached the highway, a large motorcycle came roaring past, then abruptly stopped and turned around, pulling up next to John. A female voice called out, "John, where have you been? You had the whole group worried sick looking for you everywhere." Peering closer, John recognized it was Lily, the youngest member of their current hiking group. He laughed and said, "Oh, I saw an interesting little path and had to explore where it led. Sorry to make everyone fret. Let's head back now." Though slightly puzzled, Lily nodded. She drove off ahead to lead the way. The county seat of Santa Fe, New Mexico was the administrative center closest to the Mexican border in the state, with many pristine scenic areas rarely visited by tourists. John's hiking group this time consisted of 12 people total, all planning to meet up in Santa Fe town after exploring the whole county. They would have a final dinner together before heading back to visit the Fort Duncan Tunnel Complex, then concluding their 2-week southwest sightseeing trip to return to Dallas. It took another half hour before John and Lily were less than 10 miles outside Santa Fe town. They reunited with the rest of the hiking group on a remote bend of the highway, known for its many blind spots. Over the years, more than a few accidents had occurred here due to limited visibility. The group leader on this trip was Tim, a young archaeology PhD candidate. Aside from his archaeology passion, Tim also loved adventuring to famous landmarks and scenic areas. Hearing John had gone missing, Tim had earlier dispatched 4 others to search for any trace of him. Lily had been the 5th sent out, and finally managed to locate John. Seeing John return, Tim let out a sigh of relief. He said, "I was afraid you had died out there somewhere. Where on earth did you disappear to?" John scratched his head sheepishly, then seemed to remember something. "Everyone, take a look at what I found," he said, pulling out the red blanket to show Tim, Lily, and the other 8 members here. Seeing John produce a glossy, shimmering red blanket, Lily was immediately drawn to it. "Oh, how beautiful," she exclaimed. "Where did you get this?" Standing next to Lily, Tim just kept frowning deeply as if lost in thought about something. Asked about the blanket's origins, John readily told the full story. "It's quite odd. I found it in a tribal woman's house at the very end of the footpath I took. But strangely, right after taking hold of this blanket, I fainted unconscious. When I awoke, her house had vanished without a trace, and I found myself lying in the middle of the road." Finishing his account, everyone laughed, assuming John was joking to scare them. Tim alone said nothing about it. He just remained silent briefly before commenting, "There are still 4 others who went back to search for you. We need to wait for them before we can continue on. They probably won't make it back tonight, so let's find a nice open area nearby to set up camp for the night." John scratched his head sheepishly and said, "I'm sorry. Because of me, everyone has to suffer like this. Otherwise, we could have all been sleeping cozily in a warm motel tonight." Tim didn't say anything, just turned to look for a place to make camp. Seeing this, Lily turned to encourage John. "Oh, don't worry, John. We're all hiking together. The most important thing is supporting each other in times like this. You have nothing to feel guilty about." Lily winked playfully at John with her sweet charm, then suddenly pointed at the red blanket he was holding and said, "Could you lend that to me for a bit? I just love how gorgeous it looks." John blanked out for a moment before realizing what Lily meant. He nodded and smiled. "Sure, go ahead and borrow it. Just remember to give it back to me later. I'll go help Tim set up camp." John grabbed his camping gear off the motorcycle seat and headed in the direction Tim had gone, looking for a spot to make camp for the night. At this remote bend in the road, there was a very spacious open field, right by the edge of a deep, yawning ravine. The clearing stretched over 300 feet wide, perfect for their entire group to pitch tents and camp overnight. The warning signs were posted about the area's history of accidents and danger. Adventure enthusiasts routinely ignored them. They continued choosing this picturesque spot as a place to rest and camp, mostly because of the stunning scenery. Far in the distance across the road was a cascading waterfall, white and foaming, pouring into the lush green depths of the valley below. On the cliffs beside the waterfall, the clear night sky glittered with bright stars, the moon gleaming across the valley to create an extremely breathtaking vista. Moreover, despite the posted hazards and history of accidents here, they had all involved vehicles plunging over the cliff. Never any human casualties in this open field itself. So thrill seekers felt safe indefinitely camping here. Lily received the red blanket from John's hands and held it against her face, closing her eyes to relish the feel. She absolutely loved this blanket. She thought it over, then suddenly got the idea to try buying it from John. Once John and Tim finished setting up camp, Lily sidled up close to John and whispered in his ear, "John, this blanket is gorgeous. Why don't you let me keep it? Name your price, I'll pay anything." John looked at Lily and laughed. "You're joking around. This blanket isn't anything special." Lily stopped smiling. She stated firmly and decisively, "John, I'm serious. I really love this blanket. Can you sell it to me?" John was slightly taken aback. He hadn't expected Lily to really think that. But if Lily liked the blanket, John was also quite fond of it himself. He had to go through a lot of trouble to obtain it, at least in that imagined scenario. That was true. John had never considered selling the blanket to anyone, but now Lily directly asking to buy it put him in an awkward spot. Just as he was hesitating, unsure how to respond, the loud roar of a motorcycle engine rang out. A middle-aged bearded man with shaggy hair rounded the bend on the deserted road. As soon as those in the hiking group caught sight of him, they knew right away who it was. It was Hank, the first person Tim had dispatched to search for John. Seeing John had returned, his bike parked in the open field, Hank heaved a sigh of relief. Dismounting his ride, he came over to John and scolded playfully, "Kid, you had me circling this highway back and forth dozens of times. No cell signal, I was afraid you died out there somewhere." Hearing Hank guffawing, John scratched his head and smiled. "Sorry, I made everyone worry so much." Hank waved his hand, dismissing the apology as unnecessary. "Don't treat me like an outsider." Then Hank suddenly noticed Lily clutching the red blanket tightly. Puzzled, he asked, "Lily, what are you doing hugging that blanket so tightly? Where'd you get it from anyway? I've never seen it before. Let me take a look." Hank reached toward Lily, abruptly wanting to borrow the blanket. Lily froze up momentarily, but shyly held out the blanket to Hank. As she handed it over, she felt a tinge of reluctance. John explained, "It's because of this blanket that I got everyone caught up in this mess. I found it off a footpath in a tribal woman's house." Taking the blanket from Lily's hands, Hank nodded and cajoled, "Yeah, this blanket really is gorgeous. I've never cared much for frivolous, flashy stuff like this, especially bedding. But damn, this blanket is just too beautiful. My wife would love it back home. Hey kid, why not leave it for me?" As soon as Hank took the blanket, he kept stroking and caressing it, marveling at how unbelievably smooth and silky the fabric was. Meanwhile, Lily panicked, hurriedly explaining over and over to make sure Hank wouldn't take her cherished blanket. Hank, I already asked John to sell me that blanket first. You can't have it." Hank stroked the blanket in his hands, enjoying its feel even more the longer he touched it. He clicked his tongue and said, "Oh dear, but it still belongs to John right now. He can sell it to whoever he wants. Your home isn't lacking in nice bedding and fabrics. Women always have so much stuff. Come on, let me get this for my wife to use. John's a single guy. He probably doesn't need it anyway since it's so flashy." Seeing the two tussling back and forth over it, John laughed helplessly, not knowing what to say. After waiting a while longer, the other three people dispatched to search for John also returned. Following the same tire tracks as Hank, they had just gotten back and were immediately drawn in by the blanket's allure. It was like some kind of sorcery. In the end, no one managed to forcibly buy or snatch the blanket, and John did not agree to sell it either. Everyone was resentful, returning to their own tents, still sulking and refusing to speak to each other. Tim was the group leader and had to step in multiple times to smooth things over before the situation calmed down. Still, there were sideways glances thrown between them full of irritation. Most of all, everyone's gaze lingered longingly on the red blanket in John's hands. The starry night stretched boundlessly across the mountain range, the sweeping scenery gloriously beautiful. But at this time, most of the group no longer had the mood to appreciate the stunning sights of their hike. It seemed all their mental states had changed drastically ever since the red blanket appeared. It was the crux of every problem. That night turned out to be a long, grueling night, and also a night soaked in horrifying bloodshed. After hastily eating dinner, everyone retreated back to their own private tents. Some snuck over to John's tent, demanding to secretly negotiate buying the blanket in order to get a leg up on the others. Greedy, calculating minds began to emerge, and John at the center always had to bear the brunt of it. The one who came looking was Tony, a young engineer, 2 years John's junior. Right after hurriedly eating dinner, Tony had snuck over from his own tent to John's to talk. Tony sat at the opening of the tent, asking John to lend him the red blanket because he felt cold. Tony was only 24 this year, unmarried, and still a bachelor. Tony always hoped to find someone to be his lifelong companion. When Tony touched the red blanket, he constantly felt as if he was stroking a woman's bare skin, barely able to resist the temptation. It was as if this blanket alone could provide him a warm body to cuddle with at night, fully satisfying his desire for companionship. Hence, Tony's greatest wish at this moment was to be able to purchase the blanket from John's hands. Tony was utterly infatuated with the blanket. Tony wrapped the blanket around himself, constantly caressing and stroking it. At first he maintained a polite conversation with John in response, but eventually Tony became utterly engrossed in fondling the blanket as if seducing a woman, no longer paying any mind to John at all. Seeing Tony clinging possessively to the blanket, even getting ready to return to his own tent with it, John spoke up, demanding it back. "All right, if you're heading back, could I have that blanket returned, please?" Lost in a stupor over the blanket like a mindless fool, Tony was jolted back to awareness. He seemed a little ashamed, but still reluctant, asking, "Or how about you let me borrow it just for tonight? I'll bring it back to you tomorrow morning, okay?" John laughed and said, "You're joking. Come on, hand that blanket over so I can get some sleep." Tony refused with a defiant tone, making John's face burn red with anger as he got up to snatch it back. The two were polite at first, but John soon lost his patience and began yelling at Tony. Their quarrel drew the attention of the whole group. Khan was the first to rush over, seeing Tony wrestling the blanket from John's grip. He shouted angrily, "Tony, let go of that blanket and give it back to John. What do you think you're doing, you thief?" John also shouted back furiously, "You piece of shit. I was polite with you so many damn times, but you just won't get it. If you don't know shame, then I'll beat some into you." John charged forward and punched Tony full force on the head. Furious, Tony threw the blanket aside and charged at John, the two exchanging blows. The group descended into chaos, some shouting encouragement, others jumping in to break it up. With the house on fire, the rats came scurrying out, and it was no surprise for thieves to appear. After the brawl ended, John and Tony gradually calmed down and made peace. But when John returned to his tent, he found the red blanket had vanished. He asked around everywhere, but no one admitted taking it. Tony had just been punched, and certainly wasn't the one who took it, leaving John resentful that someone had stolen it from under his nose. Those in the group started becoming suspicious of each other, especially those who had wanted to buy the blanket from John before were even more upset, turning on each other. First, Hank went to Lily and said, "Lily, tell the truth. You took advantage of John and Tony fighting to sneak off with the blanket, didn't you? You were the one who liked that blanket most. It couldn't have been anyone but you." The woman in Lily flared up. She retorted sarcastically, "Hank, how could you say that, accusing me of being a thief? I think you're clearly the one who did it. Look at you, all scruffy and shaggy. You look just like a burglar. You're a big strong man. Amidst their tussle, you snatched the blanket away, right? Tell the truth. Don't wrongly accuse others when you're the one who stole it." Hank's eyes bulged furiously. He had always hated when people said he looked like a thief. There was nothing to be done about his natural build. You couldn't judge someone's character based on their looks. Yet Lily had called him a thief, even saying he resembled a robber. That stung Hank even more, like pouring oil on fire. Slap! Hank charged forward, grabbing Lily's hair and slapping her viciously, knocking her to the ground with blood dripping down her face. At the same time, Khan stomped around the camp searching for any trace of the red blanket, but couldn't find it. Enraged, he turned and shouted at John, "John, you hid that blanket yourself, so No one else could buy it, right? That's a really shitty thing to do, turning us all against each other, suspecting theft. I've searched everyone's tent except yours. It must be in there." Hearing Khan say this, John was already upset about losing the blanket. He immediately flew into a mad rage, rushing to grab Khan's neck and punching him over and over, screaming, "You piece of shit. If I still had that damn blanket, why would I say any of that? It was mine. I could sell or not sell it to whoever I wanted. What business of yours was it that I had to hide it?" Seeing the group descend into chaos over a mere blanket, Tim, as group leader, once again had to intervene in each skirmish. First was Hank and Lily's spat. He had to break that one up fast, since Hank had beaten Lily until she was bloody and battered, hair askew. Next was John's turn, who had also punched Khan unconscious. Tim mediated well into midnight before things finally settled down somewhat. Everyone was resentful, crawling back into their tents to sleep. But things did not end there, exactly at midnight. A terrifying raspy scream ripped through the air, like someone's throat gurgling up water. Everyone shot awake to see Lily emerging from Hank's tent, her face covered in blood. Clutching the red blanket tightly in hand, she shrieked, "It was him! I found it in his tent. The bastard deserved to die that way." Lily looked around wildly, then seemed to fear someone might snatch the blanket from her. She jumped on a motorcycle and raced off into the night with the red blanket. Tony and Khan simultaneously yelled, "Holy shit! That bitch just killed someone and stole the blanket to make her getaway. We have to chase her down and get it back." Then they both hopped on their bikes to pursue Lily down the highway. The rest of the group was stunned by Hank's horrific death and Lily's feral, violent reaction over such a small conflict. No one could have imagined so many things happening, all because of a mere blanket. Entering Hank's tent, they saw his throat slashed wide open, blood pooling everywhere. His shaggy beard was matted with the bloody vomit he had choked up in his final moments. Hank's terrified eyes stared vacantly, clearly shocked that sweet Lily could have done such a thing to him. And it wasn't over yet. Shortly after they dragged Hank's body from the tent, hoping there might still be a chance to save him, a loud explosion rang out, snatching everyone's attention that direction. Across the bend, through the gap in the cliffside curve, they saw a motorcycle engulfed in raging flames. A person was flung from the bike, plummeting into the depths of the valley below. Moments later, lights appeared once more down the highway bend. Khan approached on his motorcycle, exhausted and disheveled, but clutching the red blanket tightly. He parked and stood his bike off to the side, then strode toward the campsite. Halting in the middle of the road, he loudly announced his victory to the others. He declared, "That bitch forced Tony off the cliff to his death. I chased her forever before finally getting the blanket back, but she got away. She won't escape prison time for this." Khan finished, extremely satisfied, dramatically flourishing the blanket before casually proceeding toward the field. But right then, speeding downhill around the curve, a large delivery truck suddenly appeared, moving far too quickly for the night road. Beep. The blaring truck horn drew out, the driver horrified and slamming the brakes, but too late. Khan's body was smashed under the wheels, his head popping like a melon as it was crushed beneath the truck, completely unrecognizable. Everyone reeled in horror at the lightning-fast tragedy. It happened mere meters from the warning sign about accidents. The red blanket was flung to the side, just half a meter from Khan's mangled corpse under the truck wheels. Bone-chilling screams and wails echoed through the night, striking utter dread into every heart. The blaring truck horn wouldn't stop, the driver himself paralyzed by the shock of someone standing in the middle of the deserted highway at night. He had driven quickly in the empty darkness, never expecting to cause an accident like this. One horrific disaster after another occurred, ever since this red blanket was brought back by John. By now, Tim could no longer remain silent. He gathered everyone and looked at John to explain. "When I first saw the blanket, along with your description of how you obtained it, I realized there was a strong chance it was the blanket from a segment of mythological records. Though I didn't believe it was real, only a legend, but unexpectedly." John had run out to the highway to retrieve the red blanket at some point, and now clutched it tightly as he listened to Tim's explanation. Hearing Tim say this, more than a few people grew curious. A rather elderly woman named Helen spoke up to ask, "What do you mean, Tim? What is this legend you mention?" Could you recount it clearly for us? Tim nodded his head and cleared his throat to say, "Of course, but there's one small request I have before telling it. John, would you be willing to take that blanket and burn it?" John shook his head, still clinging tightly to the blanket, adamantly refusing Tim's suggestion. Tim sighed helplessly, having no other choice but to tell the full story. The record was from a Russian book about an expedition group from their country who explored China in the late Republican era. They too discovered a similar blanket from a Miao ethnic woman in Yunnan. In the end, almost the entire expedition group died. The only survivor recounted a story of wandering into a world of devils. The blanket was described by the ancient Miao as a portal to a demon kingdom. This kingdom existed parallel to the real world. Every 100 years, a red blanket would emerge and claim enough blood sacrifices to open the gates to the demon realm. Afterwards, it would unleash war and gather sufficient human bones to construct a castle of skeletons. Once this castle of bones was built, it signified the demon queen had revived. At that point, it would spell the end of an entire ethnic group. This legend was passed down by the Miao, and the expedition members' story seemed to verify it as truth, but it only caused others to ridicule it as fiction, fading into obscure records that few considered real. Tim clicked his tongue and said, "I never expected things only found in Miao mythology could actually appear before my eyes. The core of that tale explains the deeper reason the Miao ethnicity scattered and migrated across nations. It was because that demon queen had revived once." Hearing Tim's account, John murmured in awe, "Tim, if what you're saying is true, then I really did see that bone castle." Tim was suddenly alarmed and bolted upright. He urgently asked, "You saw the castle of human bones? Then we're in trouble." Tim's face gradually turned ghastly pale. Helen quickly asked him, "What's wrong?" Tim said, "If he really saw the bone castle, the demon queen must have revived. If so, many more will die." But John laughed and said, "Don't be scared, Tim. I said I saw it, but it must have been an illusion. During that illusion, I seemed to have demolished it with my own hands. Because as soon as I touched it, the castle instantly crumbled to dust." Tim shook his head. "Illusions cannot be dismissed so lightly. Because if that illusion opened, it shows the true gate to the demonic realm exists. If so, burning the blanket will be useless. When you burn it, according to that expedition account, it will simply reappear. The only way is to return this blanket to its original spot. More precisely, throw it back into that gate so it shuts permanently. We need to do this quickly, or everyone will die." A young man in the group named Jeff suddenly laughed and said, "Oh, Tim, you're just joking around. Those accidents were only coincidences. No need to get so tense about it all. I think first we should report everything to the authorities and let them come handle it. 3 people dying is no trivial matter. We also need to alert the police soon to catch Lily. She's lost it. No telling what other crazy actions she might take." Hearing Jeff's words, Tim didn't agree. He said, "All right, if you don't believe me, let's split our group in 2. One group can go back to Santa Fe town and inform the authorities to come resolve this. The rest will come with me and John to where he found this blanket and return it to its original place. We need to resolve this quickly before sunrise." Hearing Tim's breakdown, over half the people in the group agreed. They split into 2 teams. One followed Jeff, the other went with Tim. Tim's group included John, Helen, and Derek. Jeff's group had Luke, Travis, and Nathan. The 2 groups parted ways, each speeding off in opposite directions from the highway bend. It was still about 3 hours until sunrise. Everything had to be done fast before daybreak. Plus, according to Tim, if the red blanket issue wasn't quickly resolved, the death toll would continue rising. Following John's account, they swiftly found the footpath he had wandered down after a 30-minute drive. The small trail was hidden behind an enormous sycamore tree. Stretching far off were verdant, lush cornfields. In the pitch-dark night, they couldn't clearly see the scenery, only able to hear the wind rustling through the stalks of corn. The narrow footpath delved deep into the remotest mountain valleys. At first, there were a few villages visible, but going deeper in, there were only sparse, dilapidated houses scattered on the hillsides for looking after cornfields. Even further in there were only tumble-down shacks for watching the crops, looking long abandoned. Finally, Tim's group found the path's endpoint. And just as John had described, at the end of the trail, there really was a tiny house, like a haunted house. The house faced the end of the path head-on, with no other route behind it. The group simultaneously stopped in front of the house. Tim parked to the side, then turned to John and asked, "You're certain you took this blanket from here, correct?" John nodded decisively, then pointed and said, "I'm positive. This blanket was hung right on that fence over there. I took it down myself and went inside that house and met with a tribal woman, asking to buy it from her." Tim frowned, finding it odd that the blanket could be obtained so simply. In that case, where had that hellish gate come from? Finally, Tim nodded and said, "All right, let's all go in and ask around. One person stay and watch the bikes." John and Tim and Helen entered the tiny house. Still the same sight. No lamps lit inside, only a tribal woman hunched in a corner, steadily chewing something in her mouth. It oozed down like viscous, slimy, foul, and putrid slop. The woman had a shawl covering half her face, leaving visible only a red maw, chewing a piece of meat filled with protruding bones. Helen couldn't take it anymore, retching and vomiting on the spot. Only Tim remained calm, shining his flashlight at the woman and asking, "Are you the owner of this blanket?" Tim gestured at the blanket John was holding. The woman began speaking, and with each word an overpowering stench wafted up. Her ethnic minority dialect left them grasping helplessly, only Tim able to understand. As Tim listened with a furrowed brow, after a while John asked impatiently, "What's she saying?" Tim explained, "I don't get too much of it, but the gist is she's saying whoever took the blanket without her consent will have to sell their soul to the devil." John immediately responded, "But I didn't steal it. I asked to buy it from her, but she didn't agree to sell. Afterwards, when I woke up, she was gone, so I couldn't return it either. So it wasn't me who did that." Tim nodded and said, "Right, she also said you aren't the thief, because she purposefully gave it to you herself. The one who truly sold their soul to the devil is whoever stole it from you." John was shocked. After a pause, he stammered, "The one who stole this blanket from me? Wasn't that Hank? But he's dead now." Tim nodded, then turned to explain to the ethnic woman. She shook her head and replied in her minority tongue. Tim analyzed for John. "She says the one who sold their soul to the devil isn't truly dead yet. Only once that person dies can you return the blanket to her and end this whole thing." John frowned, pondering for a moment before asking doubtfully, "Did you ask who she is? That she seems to know all this so clearly?" Tim replied, "She's one of the last descendants of an ancient Miao shaman. Her duty is guarding this red blanket. But when you took it, she knew she couldn't prevent it because of a prior prophecy. Whoever obtained the blanket would have the means to break its curse." John nodded and said, "I see. So based on her words, someone truly sold their soul to the evil spirits. Who do you think that could be?" Tim thought silently, then spoke emphatically. "It's likely Lily, or possibly Tony." The three fell silent, then Helen spoke up. "But Tony already died at the bottom of that ravine. Khan himself said it." Tim shook his head. "We can't be certain. Khan was possessed by spirits then. He was just making things up. Maybe it was Lily who fell, not Tony." Helen was shocked by Tim's speculation and asked, "Then where did Tony go?" Tim shook his head again. "I don't know, but I'm certain we need to search for both their whereabouts now." Suddenly the ethnic woman spoke again. Tim became even more convinced he was right. He declared, "She emphasizes the one who sold their soul to the devil is definitely male." All three agreed the person was likely Tony. They hurriedly turned to leave and find their bikes, wanting to return to the old campsite and search for Tony. But when they got back to the bikes, they were shocked to find Derek missing. They split up to look for him, but searched fruitlessly. Finally, Tim opted to stay and continue searching for Derek, while John and Helen would go back to the camp to look for Tony. John and Helen agreed, speeding back like lunatics. An hour had passed since they arrived. Only 2 remained until daylight. They had to hurry back to the camp and verify whether Tony truly was the one who had sold his soul to the evil spirits. If so, they would have to kill him immediately. Arriving at the camp, they did indeed find Tony there. His face was scratched and caked with blood, eyes bulging wildly like a madman's. John approached Tony and called out, "Tony, you're really not dead?" Tony was startled, turning to ask John, "Where did everyone go? Why is no one else here? Is that Khan's corpse over there? Why did he die such a tragic death?" John didn't explain, only asked insistently, "Tony, where's Lily? Did you kill her?" Tony shook his head. "I truly didn't kill her. She ran my bike off the cliff, but I miraculously survived. Then she sped back up, fleeing back toward the camp. Didn't you guys see it happen?" John was shocked. He turned to Helen and asked, "She sped back up this road? Why didn't I see or hear her bike?" Tony sneered bitterly. "You didn't know. Her bike model is very advanced. It can silence the engine when needed. She just had to cut her lights and engine passing here. Didn't Khan tell you that before he died? That she had come back this way?" Helen said, "Not at all." John nodded in understanding. "It's likely when we went inside to pull Hank's body from the tent, no one was looking outside, so she escaped unnoticed. And Khan died too quickly to tell us about it." Helen agreed. "That must be what happened, but..." At this point, without finishing their sentences, they seemed to understand each other's thoughts. Together they cried out in horror, "Oh no, that woman in the cabin. She must have been Lily herself." Both were terrified, suddenly afraid for Tim and Derek's lives. Tony looked at them curiously and asked, "What's wrong with you two?" John explained, "Lily tricked us all. She disguised herself as an old ethnic woman, then fooled us into thinking you were the one who sold your soul to the evil spirits. She wanted to separate all of us, then kill us one by one." Tony suddenly bolted upright furiously. "Where is she? I'll chop her up for revenge. She killed Hank, indirectly caused Khan's death, and nearly killed me by shoving me down that ravine." John looked at his watch anxiously, then said urgently, "Only 2 hours until daylight. Tim said once it's light out, we won't be able to find that cabin again." Hearing John's analysis, all three hastily jumped on their bikes, speeding back to where he said Lily was likely waiting. After another stretch, they arrived back at the cabin's location, and there they discovered a horrifying sight. At some point, a human skull had been strung up on the cabin's balcony railing. The wind made it sway gently, the protruding tongue seeming to chant an eerie dirge. The skull could be none other than Derek's. John nodded with certainty. "Our guess was right. She's definitely here." After throwing up and catching her breath, Helen fearfully asked, "Then where's Tim?" John frowned and shrugged, saying, "Let's go inside and search carefully." Wary, the three slowly entered the cabin. Inside, they didn't see any sign of the ethnic woman who had always sat in her usual spot. Instead, a tied-up man was stuffed and gagged, whimpering in a corner. It was Tim. The three were horrified. Tony rushed forward to free Tim, but Tim kept shaking his head, moaning for Tony not to come closer. Tony ignored him, continuing ahead. Just 2 steps later, Tony's body froze and stiffened in place. Tony was dead. A wooden stake had pierced through his head. Under his feet was a spring-loaded wooden trap. The moment he stepped on it, the stake shot out and impaled his head. Even if off-center, it would still be fatal. Tim had tried warning Tony away, but Tony kept approaching and finally paid the price with his own life. Con! A sly, cold laugh suddenly rang out in the night. John and Helen together turned back toward the laugh's origin. John spotted a long-haired female figure lurking behind the rows of corn, flickering in and out of sight around the stalks. Helen ignored the shadowy figure, turning instead to Tim and asking, "How can we save you? Can we cross over now?" Tim kept nodding. John and Helen guessed there was no more danger, going over to untie and free Tim. After a while, the ropes binding Tim had all been removed. He panted heavily, then spoke non-stop as if he hadn't spoken in ages. "It's Lily. She's not dead yet." John and Helen nodded, already aware. John asked, "So what should we do now? Just kill her and be done with it?" Tim said, "She's the key. We just need to capture her, wrap her and the red blanket together and burn them right here. Then we can end this nightmare." John nodded, then curiously asked, "How did she even catch you? And where's that ethnic woman?" Could that woman have been Lily in disguise? Tim shook his head. It's a long story. First, we need to catch her. John agreed, then said to Helen, You and Tim stay here and rest. Watch the bikes. I'll go chase and catch her. Tim objected. No, I'm coming with you. John said, With just Helen here, I won't feel at ease. Let me go catch her alone. Having said that, John rushed outside, plowing into the crops. He followed the trail of trampled stalks until finally spotting Lily's shadow, flickering behind a corn thicket. John lurked like a tiger, waiting for an opening, before pouncing forcefully. He tackled and grabbed Lily in a tight bear hug. Lily struggled and thrashed, trying to break free, but her frail body was powerless, only able to make muffled cries. John kept his iron grip, dragging her back to the cabin. On the way, he noticed Lily's eyes kept tearing up as she wept. John felt rather puzzled. Having captured Lily, John escorted her into the wooden cabin, saying to Tim, I caught her, but where's that red blanket? We need to hurry or daylight will come. Tim nodded and said, All right, let me run out and grab it from my bike. I left it there. You keep holding her. Speaking, Tim turned and rushed outside. After the tiring chase, John finally inspected Lily closely. He realized her leg was injured. No wonder he could catch her so easily. After thinking a moment, he suddenly remembered Helen. Not seeing her, he looked around frantically until his eyes bulged in horror. At some point, Helen had been hanged in a dark corner of the cabin. By now, he grasped a truly horrifying truth. He yelled, Tim, you're the one who sold your soul to the devil. John was stunned, about to turn back when something heavy struck his head like a meteor. John died on the spot from the savage blow. And then, the murderer's form appeared. Tim cackled and said, That's right. I was the one who stole that damn red blanket and framed Hank for it. You idiot. Didn't you hear that old woman say the one who sold their soul to the devil was male? Now only Lily and Tim remained as survivors. Lily gazed at Tim in utter terror. He had already cut out her tongue at some point. Tim approached Lily, stroking her head gently and saying, The play has ended. You all were just sacrifices for the blanket. A few more and the ritual will conclude. Tim's icy laughter echoed through the night. An old ethnic woman emerged slowly from the underground chamber. She laboriously dragged the corpses below, meticulously slicing off the flesh to eat piece by piece. Meanwhile, Tim drew out an ID card from his jacket pocket, tearing it up. He turned to look at Lily with icy indifference. A hoarse shriek like a slaughtered pig rang out amidst the night. The woman's figure crumpled to the ground. Lily had been murdered by Tim. 3 months later, at the start of the narrow footpath, a dazed man drove his bike onto the small trail. As if possessed, he felt compelled to explore it. Reaching the path's end, he suddenly spotted a red blanket draped over the fence encircling a cabin. Delighted, he exclaimed, "Oh, this blanket is gorgeous. I need to go ask if I can buy it."